Stanley Milgram's parents, I think, were refugees from World War II, Jewish refugees to the United States. And he has a lot of great videos. There's a lot of great videos about him on YouTube if you want to look it up. But he wanted to look at why did the Nazis commit the atrocities of the Holocaust. We think back on what the Nazis subjected the internment camp prisoners to. And we are like, how could that have possibly happened? They must have just been bad people, right? Well, not necessarily so. Milgram wanted to look at how this whole concoction of social factors could have affected these people's behaviors, the Nazi soldiers in particular. How could they have carried out all of these atrocious acts, right? So in the Milgram experiment, he wanted to test the participants' obedience to authority. So what he did was he had a participant sit in a room with a giant electric shock mechanism like the one you see in this picture. And there were 30 notches on it. And he disguised this study as a learning and memory study. Basically, there was a participant in another room who was supposed to learn and remember different words for a memory task. Each time they got it wrong, they got shocked. And you had to progressively increase the shock, even up to 450 volts. And even at the end, it says XX, which, you don't have to be a medical professional or have too much information to know that probably means very dangerous, right? And so they wanted to test how these teachers would conform to the authority figure in the room. So that authority figure was just a person in a lab coat standing there, and they either said to the teacher, "You must carry on for the sake of the experiment," or "continue to administer the shock," something like that. When the participant got it wrong, right, and they kept climbing up the notches. And so they actually had the participant continue to shock the learner. The learner is the one who was getting the shock. Let me just clarify this one more time to make sure we got it. So the participant for our study was the teacher. They were teaching the learner, which was the person who received the shock, about different words and helping them do a memory task. Every time that learner got the memory task wrong, the participant or the teacher was required to shock them. Now, the teacher could not see the learner. So, the learner was in another room and was an actor, and eventually it was just a tape recording so they could have a systematic distress call, right, for each of the experimental processes. So that experimenter in the room was the one who was pushing the person to keep going. That perception of the authority pushed that person to obey, to push the teacher to continue shocking even after the participant was screaming, "Help, please, no more shocks, I can't, my heart, it hurts," right? They said all these different things to try to stop the teacher or our participant from shocking them. And this was highly controversial because it put a lot of stress on the teacher. In case I didn't explain that well enough, and you don't get it after reading the text, I've included a video on Milgram's obedience study, except this was adapted for modern day, like a TV show, so it's not actually a real study, because this would be considered highly unethical today, but it's more clear than other videos I've found on YouTube, so make sure you watch that. But what we found after this result, so this was kind of answering Milgram's question how people could be responsible for such gross atrocities, such as the can't think of words right now, the horrible events of the Holocaust, is that obedience and authority and perceptions of authority played a lot into this. 65% of people continued to administer shocks to the very end of the session, even with the double X, and the person was saying things like, "Oh, my heart hurts," or not responding anymore. Women and men were equally obeyed the authority figure, and obedience tended to decrease when the learner was in the same room as the experimenter. So, if the learner, the person who was faking having the heart pains and everything, the teacher physically touched the learner, right? You're building that communication. Sometimes that proximity can help us, right? If we separate the learner and the teacher in different rooms, there's a dehumanization factor and anonymity that comes with that that may benefit, obedience. And seeing the other teachers refuse. There's an importance in the first follower or first differentiator, right? If we see others refuse, we're more likely to refuse. This was very controversial again because the stress it put on the participants. But despite popular notions, Milgram did follow up with these people after they participated to ask them like what they thought the benefits were of the study and if they would participate in it again and different things of that nature, just to kind of keep tabs on them to make sure they weren't too messed up. But obviously a lot of ethical guidelines were put into place after this experiment, because when you convince participants that they've killed someone, yeah, it's probably not going to do well for their self-esteem. And we're also looking at the controversial time this was put out. Some people propose that, well, this was pervasive in a time of prejudice and dehumanization. Well, many would argue that these themes have always been prevalent, right? Even now, this is a big topic of conversation with the language that's used in our political climate. So, just some interesting things to think about. And finally, for fun, this isn't in your reading. Okay, this is not fun. But I've included a link to the Stanford prison experiment. It's really important because it talks about Philip Zimbardo, and it's again another study that went into obedience. Except in this case, they had college students role play as prisoners and guards. So this study is monumental because it got so bad they had to stop it early. A lot of the things that the prisoners and the guards did was not scripted, not required of the study. They simply came into those roles because of the perception of authority. So if you're interested in watching this video, this is not going to be on the test, but it's very interesting in that it demonstrates again how obedience, or the perception of obedience, these were all college students. They all knew it, how these people conformed to their different roles, despite the fact that they understood that they were in an experiment. And so this video interviews some of the participants as well as the lead researcher, Philip Zimbardo, and kind of looks at where the study went wrong, the important things they gained out of it, and how that kind of changed psychology in the sense of, finding ways to test such controversial topics, such as these dark topics, without breaching ethical guidelines. And be warned that the video contains disturbing imagery because they talk about the tortures of Abu Ghraib. And if you are not familiar with that, I recommend a quick Google search. It was a horrible, I think it happened in 2003, but it involved the torture of prisoners, involving rape, taking pictures of naked bodies, putting them in different humiliating poses, and it was a big controversy because these pictures surfaced and the government was saying how these weren't a part of orders, but they were carried out by members of the military. And so again, we revert back to these issues on obedience. Some of these people who participated in these torturous acts said, well, I was just doing my job, or I was just doing as I was told. And so we need to break that down to figure out, okay, at what point are people going to obey authority, and to what extent? And in conclusion, we are influenced by the people around us more than we recognize. That doesn't mean we're totally helpless, but that the influences are consistently occurring because we think of all these mental processes, right? Our levels of consciousness, how we think about situations, our biases, these are all going to come into play in how we take in our social surroundings and how we're going to act in accordance to them or to the expectations of others. With that being said, each person is unique and each person is going to make a choice. Some people are going to be more responsive to obedience than others. But on the whole, everyone does it on some level. And also remember that we live in a social world, where much of what we do reflects the people we encounter. So we tend to gravitate towards people who think similarly to us. So sometimes we think our thoughts are more prevalent than they are. For example, followers of Bernie Sanders currently in the primary elections, A lot of them cannot understand why Joe Biden is leading the Democratic primary. Well, we can also look at different factors that might affect the perception that our thoughts are more prevalent than they are. For example, Bernie Sanders' target demographic is generally 18 to 26-year-olds. Well, who's mostly on social media commenting on these different topics? Right? Who's going to be on Bernie Sanders' Instagram? Who's going to be on these Twitter pages? Right? Those demographics are reflective of generations that are his target audience. So the people commenting on the posts may seem like, well, he has so many more fans than I previously imagined. I don't understand how he's losing the primaries. But they're not taking into account all of the older generations who may be talking about Joe Biden, who are not on Twitter and actively or as active in social media following. I hope that makes sense. It's called well, it's like a groupthink in a sense, but we also have group polarization. So sometimes as we identify with a group, we separate from others. But it's a lot of groupthink and just thinking that our ideals are more prevalent than they are because we're consistently surrounding ourselves with people who think similarly to us. Yeah, I guess that's the best example I can think of right now. I don't want to take up too much of your time with this video. But make sure you check out those videos and follow along with the reading, and the next 2 sections will be posted next week. Let me know if you have any questions.